Psalm 68, Elohim arises, his enemies are scattered, and those who hate him flee from his presence. As smoke is blown away, you will drive them out. As wax melts before the fire, the wicked will perish in the presence of Elohim, but the righteous will be glad and rejoice before Elohim. They will celebrate with joy. Sing to Elohim, sing praises to his name. Exalt him who rides the deserts by Yah, his name, and rejoice before him. A father of the fatherless, a defender of the widow is Elohim in his holy habitation. Elohim settles the lonely in families. He leads the prisoners out to prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a sun-scorched land. Elohim, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth shook and the heavens poured down water before Elohim, the one on Sinai. Before Elohim of Israel, you sent abundant rain. Elohim, you refreshed the weary inheritance, your flocks settled therein. Elohim, from your bounty you provided for the poor. Adonai gives the command, a great company proclaims it. Kings and their armies flee in haste. She who waits in the home divides the plunder. Though you lie down among the sheepfolds, the wings of the dove are covered with silver, and her feathers with shimmering gold. When Shaddai scatters the kings of the land, it was like the snow falling from Salmon. The mountain of Elohim is Mount Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is Mount Bashan. Why do you gaze in envy, O mountains of many peaks? This is the mountain Elohim chose for his dwelling, where the Lord is. He will surely dwell forever. The chariots of Elohim are tens of thousands. Thousands of thousands are they. Adonai is in the sanctuary, as he was at Sinai. You have ascended on high. You have led captives away. You have received gifts from man, even from the rebellious, that Yahweh Elohim may dwell there. Blessed be Adonai, who daily bears our burdens, the God of our salvation. What this means in verse 20, our God is the God of deliverance. And then right here it says, our God is, and then right here it says, this part, it looks like an X. That's an Aleph, and then you got the forgot what that name of that letter is, but those two letters means God, and then this letter right here is, so God is, and then right here you see God or L, and then those two letters God. So our God is the God of deliverance, and to Yahweh Adonai is a rescuer from death, but Elohim will scatter the heads of his enemies. Elohim will shatter the heads of his enemies, the hairy crowns of those who persist in guilty ways. Adonai said, I will retrieve from Bashan. I will bring them up from the depths of the sea, that your foot may be dipped in the blood of your foes, the tongue of your dogs in the same. They have seen your marching, Elohim, the march of Eli, my king, into the sanctuary. That word Eli just means my God. So the march of my God, my king in the sanctuary. The singers lead the way, the musicians follow after. Among the maidens playing tambourines. Tambourines are instruments. So you got all the musical people playing instruments as Elohim is walking back into his sanctuary. And there's a war going on, and Elohim wins the war, and then the musicians come and they play music following. And this is a common practice for ancient kings for this kind of thing to happen. So it's almost like David's trying to relate what he's experiencing as a king and saying God is experiencing the same thing like 100-fold. Bless Elohim in the great congregation. Bless Yahweh from the fountain of Israel. There is Benjamin, the youngest, ruling them, the prince of Judah in their company, the princes of Zebulun and of Naphtali, Elohika. So this is Elohi, it means God, and then Ka, it means your. And then if you read it in the Hebrew, this first portion of the word from here to there is Elohi, and then this letter that looks like an upside down L is the Ha part. It just means your. It means like your God has commanded your strength. So it's talking about Benjamin and Judah and Zimri and all these people. And then it says, your God has commanded your strength. And then it says, show your strength, Elohim. So God uses his people to show his strength. In some versions of the Bible, like this one that I have right here, it says, show your strength, God, or command your strength, God. God is telling his people to show your strength. And then God's saying, I'm going to show you my strength through you. And then it says, which you have exhorted on our behalf. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings will bring you gifts. Rebuke the beast in the wheat, the herds of bulls among the calves of the nations until it submits. Bring bars of silver. Scatter the nations who delight in war. Think about that. Scatter the nations who delight in war. We have a God that will go to war with the enemy to defend his people, to defend Israel, to defend us. But God does not delight in doing those things. He doesn't want to be constantly at war. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, to pretty much say, you know what? I'm going to die on the behalf of all mankind so that this war can stop. This war of sin can stop. God does not delight in war, but he will go to war. It's the nations that have rejected God that have delighted in war. Envoys will arrive from Egypt. Crush will stretch out her hand to Elohim. Crush is also Ethiopia, depending on what Bible translations or version you're reading. Ethiopia, Crush, or it might say the northern portion above the Nile, but I just put a little footnote. This is Ethiopia. When I was younger, I would read the Bible and read Crush. I'm like, who's Crush? Is God going to crush someone? And I found out, oh, that's a nation. That's an ancient nation. But how do you relate it to today's time? Today's time is Ethiopia. So one day or whatever, Ethiopia will stretch out her hand to Elohim. And what does that mean exactly? Makes me wonder if this is talking about a war that's going to happen. Maybe Ethiopia will turn to God. I think there was a reference that I deleted. Yeah. Sing to Elohim, O kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord, to him who rides upon the highest heavens of Ho. Behold, his mighty voice resounds. Ascribe strength to Elohim, whose majesty is over Israel, whose strength is in the sky. Elohim, you are awesome in your sanctuary. El of Israel himself gives strength and power to his people. Blessed be Elohim. If you read this passage and you count the names of God, I sat down right before I started the video and I was like, man, how many times did David mention God in this passage or in this song? It was 41 times. I had to count that 3 times because first I counted 39, then 40, then I realized I missed one of the names of God, so I had to fix that. And then ultimately I counted 41 times. And the thing that I kept on seeing throughout the psalm was this word desert. For some reason, whenever I translate it, when I was beginning to translate this passage, I got to this verse and it says, exalt him who rides on the clouds. And so I went back to the Hebrew text and it said desert. I said, which one is it? Is it clouds or desert? It can't be both. And so I thought, well, maybe it is both. So I looked at what Bible Hub said. Then I went and I found another resource that a Jewish Christian website that they had the Hebrew Bible up there. And I found the verse and their resource said also that it meant desert. And then I thought, I'm going to go to Google Translate, type in the words, and I sat here all night. This was last night. I sat here and I thought, okay, I'm going to write down this means desert. Well, here's what it said. Desert plain, desert valley running south from the Sea of Galilee. That's what Bible Hub said. A steep, as I was looking more into it, looked like the Hebrew said that God rides on the desert, or he journeys through the desert. And we know this from scripture that God in the Old Testament, he took his people, Israel, into the desert for 40 years and they wandered through the desert. But in that time period, God built up the nation of Israel and ultimately brought them into the promised land. And then years later, I'm talking about years, decades, generations later, Jesus comes, and John the Baptist comes, and John the Baptist is baptizing people where? In the wilderness. And then Jesus spends 40 days in the desert with no food or water, being tempted by the devil. And so it makes sense that God, Elohim, he journeys through the desert. He rides the desert. But as we read it, sing to Elohim, sing praises to his name, exalt him who rides the desert by Yah, his name. This phrase Yah shows up 50 times throughout the scriptures. And if I remember right, it was a way of writing Yahweh, but in a poetic version of his name. So it's a poetic version of Yahweh, his name. And then rejoice before him, a father to the fatherless, a defender of the widow. He says the lonely in families' habitation. So right here again it says, but the rebellious dwell in a sun-scorched land. That's a desert. So that's a desert right there. Right here it says, Elohim, you went out before your people when you march through the wilderness. That's a desert. So the desert keeps on popping up. And why am I talking about the desert? Well, God's people went through the desert for 40 years. And then on year 41, that's when they go into the promised land, the land of Canaan. All of God's promises are being fulfilled. Well, David mentions God 41 times throughout this psalm. And he talks about the desert. He talks about the prisoner. He leads the prisoner to prosperity. God's people, the Hebrew people, they were prisoners to Egypt, and God brought them to the promised land. God's people, he settles the lonely in families. Moses, tell me that he wasn't lonely when after he killed that one dude, the soldier in Egypt, and then he fled to the desert. I bet you he was pretty lonely, and God gave him a family. This is talking about Israel in the desert. David is talking about Israel in the desert, but then he starts talking about war. He talks about the mountain of God, how God dwells in this mountain. And remember, in the desert, in the story of Moses and the Hebrews, there's a mountain involved, Mount Sinai. But this looks a whole lot like David is remembering. See right here, Mount Sinai. He was at Sinai. Adonai is in his sanctuary as he was at Sinai. David is remembering what God did when he brought the Hebrew people out of Egypt into the desert and ultimately into the promised land. He delivered his people. He rescued them from death. He did that many times. He brought them up from the depths of the sea, that their foot may dip in the blood of their foes, and the tongue of the dogs be the same. Right here it starts talking about war, how God is going to war for his people. And then it says that God has commended your strength. He's talking about God's people. God is commending his people to be strong. And then the rest of it is talking about how our strength that we have is not our strength, but is because God is strong, is on our behalf. So show your strength, which you have exerted on our behalf. So first it says, your God has commended your strength, talking about the people of Israel. But then at the end it says, God, show us your strength on our behalf. So our strength that we have, that we might think we have, is all from God. This reminds me of the Moses story too, whose strength is in the sky, the majesty of Israel, the one that rides on the highest heavens of old, the mighty voice resound. The reason it reminds me of the Hebrew slaves in the desert is because God led the Hebrews with a cloud of fire by night, and so whose strength is in the skies.